and there's no doubt in my mind that Russia right now is kind of thrusting, parrying a bit, kind of examining our networks to see where they can attack if they so choose. But they also understand that there's a very high cost to them if they do so, and we're going to be prepared to do that. But as far as ensuring our networks go, we have to assume that every single person is going to be the next subject of a major attack, and especially critical infrastructure, and we need to prepare our systems accordingly.
Hello and good morning. I'm Kat Zakreski, a tech policy reporter here at the Washington Post. And thank you for joining us today for our event on securing cyberspace. I'm pleased to be joined today by Representative Katko of New York. He is the top Republican on the House Homeland Security Committee. Representative Katko, thank you so much for joining us and welcome back to the Washington Post.
Thanks for having me. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. That's right, you're awake now, okay.
Thanks for waking everybody up on this rainy morning. And as a reminder to our guests, we want to hear from you. Tweet us your questions using the handle @PostLive, and we will try to get them into the conversation today. And so, Congressman, I wanted to start out. You're one of the most engaged members of Congress on cybersecurity. Since you've been in the House since 2014, how would you grade your colleagues' Congress's understanding of the cybersecurity threats we're facing as a nation today?
Yeah, I don't know about a grade, but I will say that it has evolved. When I first started on Homeland Security, CISA didn't exist, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, and the greatest threat to the homeland by far was homegrown violent extremism inspired by ISIS-type groups. You had like San Bernardino, and you had the Pulse nightclub, and all these terrible tragedies. And we've evolved from there to having cyber be the #1 threat to our country. People can be in their own rooms in Russia or Eastern Europe or China and launch major cyber attacks. And that's a whole new dynamic threat that everyone's coming to grips with as we continue on in Congress.
And as you just mentioned, I mean, over the last 8 years, we've seen a major evolution. I mean, when you joined Congress, we were talking about the Target data breach and Yahoo. And now we're seeing these attacks far more frequently, and they're far more severe. The video referenced critical infrastructure. What steps does Congress need to take today so we don't see that exponential increase in threat over the next decade?
Well, I think what we need to do is what we've already been doing, and that is to beef up cybersecurity funding across the board for for the NSA, for the .mil regime, for CISA. And I think we need to do more to empower Chris Inglis as the National Cyber Director. And the way I look at it is, you want to look at it from a team approach. Inglis is a head coach. He needs to have the powers of a head coach. You have the quarterback, I would say, of the civilian and .gov domain being CISA. You have the special teams at NSA, and then you have the offensive and defensive capabilities of the military. We got to make sure that they're all properly funded. They're doing state-of-the-art defenses. They're developing good collaborative efforts with the private sector, and they're working better together as a team, because that's why I like using the analogy of a quarterback and a head coach and all that, because they're all part of the same team, and we need to be working together to achieve the goals. And the goal is to minimize and eradicate cyber attacks having the devastating effects they have on us today.
What do you view as the top barriers preventing those groups from working together as a team today?
I think it's a new thing, to be honest with you. I mean, let's face it, I was in Congress 8 years, and CIS has only been in existence 4 years. So this is all evolving. So what we have to do going forward is to make sure we understand the respective roles of each, better define them, and then get them to work better together. And that's why I think the National Cyber Director was so very important.
And looking back on the time that you spent in Congress, was there a particular breach or hack that you feel was really a wake-up call that helped lawmakers understand how pressing this issue is?
I think the wake-up call for the country as a whole, I mean, if you're a hospital or a school, we've had wake-up calls in my district for years with the ransomware attacks, but I think the Colonial Pipeline was such a shock to the system. And when you see people filling up garbage bags of gasoline out of panic at gas stations, you know that you've got the attention of people. And that was followed up by the JBS attack and some of the others. And obviously some of the ones for us, the geeks in the cyber realm, we know about the more sophisticated attacks like the Log4j and some of those other ones that It could have crippling effects, but the Colonial Pipeline one, I think, really woke everybody up because there's critical infrastructure 101, and critical infrastructure got attacked, and we weren't ready for it.
And so you've introduced legislation that would call for identifying systemically important critical infrastructure. How would that legislation help prevent another Colonial Pipeline from
Well,
occurring?
the way we look at it is there's 16 critical infrastructure sectors, right? If they're all systemically important, then none of them are. And, you got to look at, the whole idea behind the SICI legislation, as a slang for it, would be to say, of all these critical infrastructures, this is the most critical, right? And then you identify it. But after we passed the reporting requirements legislation, incident reporting, I'm starting to see within the development of the rulemaking process at CISA that I think it's going to shake itself out without the necessity for that legislation. Some wanted legislation that was more, I don't want to say bureaucratic, but it's a word, regulatory in nature. And I think that would be a mistake. I think we need to continue with the collaborative effort we're developing with the private sector and CISA, information coming in, taking that information, operationalizing it, and then send it back out in a better way and form. And I think hopefully this rulemaking process is going to do that. And I saw one of the RFIs recently, which is very encouraging in that regard.
So this legislation was based on recommendations from the Cyber Solarium, and some of the Democrats said that your proposal initially didn't go far enough. Any bill addressing critical infrastructure needs to also address what the companies and government need to do as a result of the designation. You just said you're concerned about too much bureaucracy. What's at risk with having legislation that's
Well, the risk is, I think we should learn from some of the past agencies that have been developed and how they've grown into regulatory behemoths that sometimes lose their way. I think what happened especially with Ukraine, in the cyber attacks that happened in Ukraine, which preceded the invasion of Ukraine, and the threats to the West from Russia, the continued threats today, and the intelligence bearing out that they're pecking around, getting ready to do a major attack, perhaps. I think that showed that we need to be more collaborative with the private sector. Like CISA came up with like Shields Up, for example. You can go to the website, Shields Up, and you can help your systems right away. And what we're seeing is that the private sector is incentivized to work with CISA. If you get a regulatory scheme, it becomes almost like a shirts and skins game, where they're on one side and they're on the other side. That's what we're trying to avoid. And I understand and completely respect what people are saying as far as the SICI legislation, but I think we can't lose sight of the fact that the private sector has to have the comfort to work and trust with a teammate, that being CISA, as opposed to more of a dictatorial or rulemaking agency that's overseeing and causing all kinds of problems with them. Because I think CISA is a unique agency in that the synergy between the private sector and CISA is the only way that CISA can be successful. And if they're not, if they don't have that synergy and that exchange of information on a fluid basis, like we do in the Joint Terrorism Task Forces, like I worked with for 20 years as a federal prosecutor, if you don't have that fluidity, I think you have problems.
But when we're talking about such severe attacks on pipelines, on energy grids, can we really leave that up to the private sector?
Oh, we're not leaving it to the private sector. No, make no mistake about it. There's going to be rules. There's going to be rulemaking with the incident reporting. And the incident reporting, as it shakes out, I think will tell us whether or not we ultimately need the SICI legislation and what kind. There was a disagreement, and it's rare for most of us in Homeland to have disagreements on cyber between the Republicans and Democrats. But that was one area where we had disagreements. So that's why I didn't get across the finish line. So what I'm saying is the rulemaking process, I think, will shake out a lot of the concerns that both sides have. And then if we need to do something on the back end, we can do it. But I'm not sure we're going to need to. We'll have to take a look and see.
And you mentioned the situation in Ukraine, and I want to talk a little bit about what we've learned so far from the war. Given the cyber attacks that we've seen on Ukraine, do you think that we need to rethink the global cybersecurity norms?
Absolutely. Anybody who's familiar with NATO knows what Article 5 is. And Article 5 is what's an act of war. And every military in the world now, any credible military, has a pretty significant cyber command. And that's not just for the heck of it. That's because that is the modern face of warfare. So we don't know what should be considered an act of war yet. But I think we need to decide within our team here, with the National Cyber Director, the NSA, the .mil, and with CISA, take input from all. What is considered an act of war in the modern space, or is any cyber attack an act of war? And then you need to have that similar conversation with NATO countries, and I think we have to tweak the rules accordingly, right? Look what happened in Ukraine. Before they went in, like I mentioned, they had massive cyber attacks, which were an attempt to cripple their systems before they went in. That's how is that not considered an act of war, right? But is every cyber attack an act of war? I don't think so, but we have to figure out what the red line is, or if you can even decide what the red line is, and have to have those conversations.
What do those conversations look like today? Because I think, senators and lawmakers first raised that issue back in February when we saw the invasion. So what kind of progress have you made? What kind of ideas have you heard since then?
It's in its nascent stages, no doubt about it. And we have to have more of a discussion based on a forensic analysis of what happened within Ukraine. And if and when Ukraine becomes part of NATO, or if they still share their information with NATO countries, NATO is now, ironically, stronger than it's ever been since World War II because of Russia's interference in Ukraine, and that's exactly what Russia didn't want to have happen. So having this discussion is something that the NATO countries and we all have to have.
And I just want to ask really specifically, because you kind of touched on this in your earlier answer, but should a cyber attack on a NATO country trigger Article 5?
It's a great question. I mean, that's the discussions we have to have. But like I said, it's a face of modern warfare, is cyber. There's no question about it. And we need to understand that, digest that, and try and figure out where those new lines lie. Because quite frankly, we haven't done it enough yet.
And while we're on this topic, I also wanted to talk about foreign disinformation. Do you think that the United States is currently prepared for any foreign disinformation we might face during the midterm elections?
We weren't in previous elections. I think we're getting better every election. But I think the problem we still have is which agency or which entity within government should be spearheading it or should be at the forefront of it. The rollout of Homeland Security's disinformation board was an utter disaster because we didn't understand it. And so we can't have that again. CISA should play a role, but the others too. If it's a foreign actor, a foreign state, for example, China, Russia, especially Russia, I don't think CISA should be the only person making decisions on what to do and how to respond. It's got to be more of a collaborative effort within multiple agencies, from the State Department to the White House.
You mentioned the failed rollout of the Homeland Security Disinformation Board. How can the federal government address disinformation at this time when Republican lawmakers are raising concerns about social media censorship?
Yeah, that's a legitimate concern, and it's highly likely that Republicans will be controlling the House next term. And so they're going to have to engage with Republicans on this. The problem with the Disinformation Board was it was not a bipartisan effort. I can tell you from my own work in Congress, the best bills, the best legislation, and the best results are when you work in a collaborative manner. Benny Thompson and I have worked together very well over the last 8 years. And Homeland Security, by its nature, tends to be more collaborative. We have very serious disagreements with the border. Put that aside, cyber and other areas within the Homeland Security mission, we are very collaborative, and cyber is one of them, and we need to continue to be that way. You can't have something as difficult and fraught with possible infringement of individuals' rights of free speech without having a collaborative effort, and that's why I think the Disinformation Board was such a failure.
Since the revelations of Russian disinformation after the 2016 election, we've seen a greater collaboration between the tech companies and organizations like CISA and other national security agencies. Do you think that's a positive development?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Listen, some people within my party will scream that they're all just out to get them. No, that's a bunch of crap. They're not. Okay. But at the same token, do we need to have a better understanding of what they do and how they do it? I mean, look at all the concern now that's being enunciated because of Elon Musk taking over Twitter. Now the pendulum swinging the other way. So, that aside, we need to have a better synergy between the two. If you're not getting the theme here, everything I talk about is working together, because that's something we've lost in this country and we've lost in Congress, and that's what we got to do more of, for sure.
And I'm just curious because you just mentioned the Elon Musk Twitter deal. And I wanted to ask you, given your work on Homeland Security, Elon Musk has strong business ties in China. There is talk about whether or not he's been in direct communication with Vladimir Putin. Do those activities pose a national security risk as he takes control of a major American social media platform?
I think you have to get more information. I think it'd be irresponsible to say yes or no until we know if he had the conversations and what are the nature and quality of the conversations, right? But clearly it's something we should keep an eye on, clearly.
Yeah, I mean, he's confirmed that he talked to Putin at least once 18 months ago, and then there's a report that he had a more recent call. I mean, this is an unprecedented situation in many ways to have a tech executive have that kind of communication. I mean, what steps could the federal government even take if it turns out that he did have those?
Well, I mean, like I said, it's a murky time, right? And it's a murky time with Twitter and the government and disinformation and who gets banned and why, or should they be banned? Should everyone just have unfettered access to the internet? All those types of things. We've done a good job of pointing out the problems, but very few people have talked about solutions. And I don't pretend to have the solutions for that, but it's going to be a whole of government approach to it. We can't just have one party, the other party doing it, one agency. It's got to be people together that really figure out how to best manage this new minefield. I mean, it's such a complicated world now. When I was a kid, we had ABC, CBS, NBC, and public television. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have like 24-hour news cycles where you can go get your scratch itched and not have to hear an alternative point of view. That's all we have now, and that's then we have social media overlaying it, and it's a very difficult time, and it's like the brave new frontier that we've got to figure out.
And so one proposal you've introduced, a bipartisan bill to identify foreign propaganda on social media, incorporate labels. We saw some companies do more of this, especially in the fallout of the Russian invasion into Ukraine. Right. Do you think those labels are effective or do enough to flag this to users?
It's a start. It's a start for sure. It's flagging a problem and it's identifying a problem. I don't necessarily think it's going to be the solution, but it's a start in the right direction because that's by passing that, we would be acknowledging that there is a problem and that needs to be addressed for sure.
And one of the things that we've seen with foreign disinformation is that it seeks to sow discord and amplify existing divisions within the American public.
I was a little experienced with that, running for office 4 times. Yeah. So, yeah.
And so, I mean, given the political dynamic today and the fact that we have multiple Republican candidates running still, on this message of election denialism, does that create an opportunity for foreign disinformation and foreign actors?
Perhaps. I think it's a very troubling trend within our party, and I'm hoping that will change soon and it'll be tamped down, but that is something that's a very big concern for me.
Have you personally warned members of your party that poses a potential national security risk?
Have I warned them? No. Have I said words to the effect of, "Are you nuts?" Yeah, I've said that. Yeah.
And so, I mean, I wanted to ask you, obviously you're leaving Congress soon. How do you feel about the state of the Republican Party at this moment?
Like any party, it's a big, the bigger the tent, the better. I think that we have concerns within the quote unquote family of the Republican Party. I am concerned that both parties have less tolerance for moderation. And I think that if you look at the Democratic side, a lot of the moderates are getting squeezed out, and the same with the Republican side. And there's an intolerance for anything other than 100% or nothing on both sides, and that's a real concern. And I would say this, and I'll do this with all of you right here. Raise your hand if you've ever been in a personal relationship or if you've ever been in a business relationship. Everybody has. Raise your hands, right? Now, raise your hands if you got 100% out of that relationship or deal. No one ever does. So why do we expect it from our politicians? That's not what our country was founded upon. And so I'm concerned that both parties have gone too far to the left, too far to the right. And they've got to understand that working together with the other side is a good thing. If you look at Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, what they got done together, diametrically opposed politically, but they did things and came together for the sake of the country. We need to get back to that, for sure.
And I wanted to ask about that in the context of cybersecurity, which has been a relatively bipartisan issue during these polarized times.
Very much so, yeah.
We're losing 2 cybersecurity heavyweights with both you and Jim Langevin, the Democratic co-founder of the Congressional Cybersecurity Caucus. So do you think this bipartisan streak within cybersecurity can continue after you leave?
It has to, and I think it will. And I think by and large, people understand in the Homeland Security realm, at least traditionally on the committee, that some things are bigger than your party. And a lot of things, I think a lot of people can say it's easy. We're all agree we want to protect the homeland. We may have difference of opinions around the edges, but we all believe we want to have better cybersecurity. And we all believe we want to have safer systems. And we all believe we want to be able to clap back at the bad guys. And we want to be able to have deterrence. And we want a better protection. So I think we will. And I think there's a lot of people coming up that will pick up that mantle. And don't forget, when I came to Congress, I was a federal organized crime prosecutor for 20 years. I did very complicated, crazy cases, and I earned all my gray hairs. But I didn't know much about cyber before I got here, because the biggest threat to Homeland when I first got here, like I said, was ISIS, and those inspired major events. Now, out of necessity, I've had to become an expert on cyber. And I think there's plenty of people coming up that already have a working knowledge of cyber that will be able to pick up the mantle and run with it, no question in my mind.
And given that expertise that you've developed on cyber, what assessment would you give the Biden administration's record so far on cybersecurity?
I think they've had great appointments in the leadership positions. I think Inglis is superb, and I think Jen Easterly at CISA is a terrific appointment, and some of the others that they've had. I mean, I think they got a very strong team across the board. And now that they've got these great leaders, the trick is going to be able to empower them, properly fund them, and make sure they all get along well in the sandbox. And that's probably the last part of the puzzle we need to do.
And as you leave Congress, what is the cybersecurity threat that you're most worried about?
A catastrophic threat on a critical infrastructure sector, be it a grid, be it a water system. Look what happened in Florida. If that guy didn't stumble across what was going on at that water system in Florida, thousands of people would have been poisoned, maybe killed. That shows the vulnerability of our systems. And what keeps me up at night, when Trump was in office, two things kept me up at night. What he tweeted in the morning before I got up.
Same.
And the other thing was there a catastrophic attack overnight somewhere? And now I worry all the time about cyber attacks, because you still hear CEOs and leaders of businesses saying, I don't want to hear about cyber attacks. I don't want to hear that our system's been compromised. We can't have this out. You got to keep it quiet. And that is the biggest concern. I think people should embrace it and attack it, and don't sweep it under the rug. And that's what we got to do going forward. And that's the whole idea of what we're talking about today, I guess.
Well, unfortunately, we're just about out of time. Representative Katko, thank you so much for joining us today. My colleague Damian Paletta will be out here with our next guest after this video. Please stay with us.